Much like Pitbull, you could refer to the vampire as Mr. Worldwide. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Launch. The vampire is not just one of the best-known creatures in monster lore, it's also arguably one of the oldest, if you go based on the specific act of vampirism, which is to, we'll use the term draw for the sake of YouTube, to draw out the essence, the blood, any sort of other fluids, depending on which vampire you're talking about, of a human being. Of course, vampires get a hell of a lot more specific than something that just sucks your blood or your energy, your life force, something like that. But it took them a while to get there, because what we know today is the vampire, or anybody, of course, who went to middle school in the, early 2000s, mid-2000s, remembers the Twilight series and how they were glittery, sparkly creatures that were teenagers forever. Well, in order to get there, we had to go through some steps. Back in the 90s, vampires were a little bit more darker, and they were kind of gothic to an extent. You had Buffy the Vampire Slayer, of course. You also had The Addiction, the remake of Dracula, and other movies that made vampires dark and scary, because in the 90s, everything was dark and scary. But dark and scary to sparkly is not the only change they've undergone, even on the silver screen. Vampires have been a big facet of Hollywood all the way back to the beginning. For example, 1958's Dracula, based off of the Bram Stoker book by the same name, includes a wealthy Romanian aristocrat who is also a vampire, and in the book form, he can turn into a bat. Of course, in the Dracula narrative, you can become a vampire if a vampire drinks your blood and doesn't drain all of it out of you. But that's not how it always goes. For example, in 1987's The Lost Boys, the vampires, rather than being aristocrats in Eastern Europe, are a biker gang in California. That version of a vampire requires you to drink vampire blood to become a vampire. And in this version of things, it's not just drinking the vampire blood that turns you into one, it makes you sort of a semi-vampire. And once you feed for the first time, that's when you become a real vampire. Taking it further into the 2000s, with TV, we saw Supernatural portray vampires pretty frequently, and in a pretty fleshed out storyline. One of the most underrated parts of that show, in my opinion, is their depiction of vampires, vampire culture, and how the hierarchy worked. Of course, in that one, you would be bitten, and then you would have to feed to complete the transformation process. So it kind of mixes the Dracula and Lost Boys aspects. So the question is, where did Hollywood get all of these ideas? Obviously, the seminal work on the modern vampire, as far as literature goes, is Dracula by Bram Stoker. But where did Bram Stoker get his Dracula? The best-known vampire legends come out of Europe. And you know what else comes out of Europe? Me! So I'm going to take this moment to thank our sponsor for this video, MyHeritage. MyHeritage is a DNA and ancestry record service which gives you the tools to explore and understand your family history and identity. And with how things have been going with Bigfoot lately, I figured maybe we should take another angle. Maybe I should see if we're related and we can just share that familial bond. I wasn't, but if you're curious about yourself, it's super easy. Simply by submitting a couple of cheek swabs, you can find out all sorts of detailed information about who you are, and you may even find some surprises. For example, much like the topic of today's video, I am unexpectedly more Balkan and Greek than I thought. MyHeritage will also show you people who match your DNA profile so that you can connect with relatives you may have never even known you had. In addition, MyHeritage offers a fantastic record search function so you can really flesh out and understand your family tree. If you'd like to try MyHeritage, buy a DNA kit using the link in our description and use the coupon code that's down there to get free shipping. As an added bonus, you can try a 30-day free trial of their best subscription family history research tools and enjoy a 50% off discount if you choose to continue. And just like my mysterious apparent Balkan origins, there are some mysterious Balkan origins for the vampire. The best known versions of the vampire legend in the Western sphere do come from Europe, though they exist basically all over the planet except for Antarctica. But when I say that, I'm not saying that the exact archetype of the vampire as it appears in Dracula is universal. What's really universal is the idea of sucking out something, be it life essence, be it blood, be it some other fluid. Again, very broad spectrum of vampires. In some cultures, it was demons who did the sucking. One of the most recognizable was the succubus. Of course, that didn't drink blood, but we'll move on swiftly from that one for the sake of YouTube. Suffice to say that it's of Latin origin, and it's a demon that takes the female form. In the Greek tradition, the Empusae are frequently referenced as one of the biggest impacts on vampire lore from the classical period. Like Stoker's vampire, the Empusae are capable of shapeshifting. For example, in the work of the classical Greek playwright Aristophanes, in his play Lysistrata, in which a number of women decide to go on a strike of a certain activity to convince their husbands to stop fighting each other in the Peloponnesian War, very ironic because this is a Greek play. It is a comedy, by the way. In that version, the Empusae are able to shapeshift into many different types of animals. And before one of you does, comedy meant something different in ancient Greece than it does today. Yes, I know the difference between comedy today and comedy in ancient Greece. I know. Interestingly enough, they are one-legged, with that one leg being made of either bronze or copper, or in some versions, a donkey's leg. And they are either the daughters of, or simply a class of beings commanded by, the goddess Hecate. In Philostratus the Elder's late 2nd or early 3rd century work, The Life of Apollonius of Tyana, the titular character actually meets an Empusae or an Empusa, I should say, on the way from Persia to India, if I remember correctly. It takes the appearance of a beautiful young woman, but Apollonius sees through this and orders his companions to start yelling at it and driving it away, at which point it runs away screaming. An Empusa's exact behavior may vary when it comes to it actually committing the act of vampirism. It will either just suck the blood, or it will devour the person completely. It really depends on which legend you're using. And the Empusae actually make their own appearance in modern vampire lore in the 1922 film Nosferatu, where a ship is named the Empusae. But over time, the concept of a vampire kind of evolved from blood-sucking demon to undead blood-sucking person. Or, in many cases, corpse inhabited by the spirit of a person or by a demon. But it shifted to a much more corporeal, humans are involved in this kind of thing. And in general, an undead, cannibalistic monster is known as a revenant. Now, of course, there are specific things that come with this, and I'll get into that. Revenants, of course, might be inspired themselves by an earlier aspect of this lore, an earlier undead creature, the Old Norse Draugr. These appear in the Icelandic sagas as corpses inhabited by the spirit of the person who once was in that body, but that person has been reanimated because they were greedy or evil, and now they defend their territory to the death. So Skyrim actually kind of spot on for that one. I'm sure many of us were traumatized by Bleak Falls Barrow as children. More broadly, revenants are reanimated corpses or sometimes apparitions who have little motivation other than harming the living. And typically, they target people that they actually knew in life. I will say it is worth noting that into the medieval period, the church did continue to go on the demonic possession route, even when it came to the undead, and I could comment on how unsound the theology of a demon inhabiting a dead corpse is, but the Catholic Church at the time wasn't very concerned with theology anyway, so it's probably not worth it. You have to remember this is the same Catholic Church that told people they could pay to get into heaven. And if you want the sweatshirt on screen right now, the link is in the description. In some versions of this tale, the Revenant did suck blood, but that wasn't universal. It also did other things, like cause hallucinations or plagues. It could just generally cause mischief in your community. And in perhaps the most striking resemblance to vampire lore, they must be decapitated. You cannot kill them in any other way. Other weapons will just bounce off or not harm them. They will just go into their bodies and, oh, okay. No, you gotta chop off the head and then probably burn the corpse also. Remember, kids, if you're gonna kill it with fire. Later on, revenants would take on a different role and become people sent back to right their wrongs, but that was a bit of a ways down the line. That's like 17th, 18th century. But we start to close in on the actual revenant lore that we want to pay attention to here as it becomes the modern vampire. And one of those creatures is the Vrykolikas of Greece. That's right, I bet you didn't expect Greece to be so involved in a video about vampires. Now, I will be fair here. We don't know specifically where the Vrykolikas originated. It may have been Balkan, as the term originates from a Balkan word, varkolak. But the lore specific to the Vrykolikas was consolidated in Greece. To be clear, as I've said, it's not the only revenant or blood-sucking creature in Greek tradition, as we do in fact have grave sites with stakes driven into the corpses dating back to the Neolithic era. So clearly, even back in the Stone Age, people were having some vampire issues, or at least what they perceived to be vampire issues. Now, why would you put a stake through a corpse? Well, it's a pretty crude manner of keeping a dead person in their grave. In one such case of a revenant burial at Camarina, an ancient Greek city in Sicily, a body had heavy pieces of amphorae, those are large Greek pottery jars used for either storage or transportation of goods. They had pieces of it, and we're talking like heavy, hefty pieces here, placed over the head and feet to make sure that whatever was in that grave was not getting out. And burials of this sort, where something was either spiked in, staked in, or held in with something heavy, lasted and appear all the way up into the 15th and 16th century when the Ottomans were taking over the Greek world. The Greeks living under Ottoman rule were still practicing these burial techniques. In these burials, the body was pinned into the grave with 20 centimeter or 7.8 inch long spikes placed through the neck, pelvis, and feet, and possibly also the hands, to really make sure that if that thing woke up, it was stuck. But the burial spike wasn't the only way of keeping a revenant down. No, there were other ways. For example, if you bury the corpse face down, it will be too confused to get out. Tools and other valuable items might be placed near or in the burial to appease any evil spirits. This might be a derivative of the practice of putting a coin into the mouth of the deceased so it could pay to get over the river Styx. And in some places where you really wanted to make sure things weren't going to go anybody else's way but your own, you might cut the tendons so the thing can't move if it gets back up. And fascinatingly, belief in the vrykolakas existed and persisted into the 20th century, and during World War II, people were so concerned about the mass graves and mass burials because of war, famine, sickness, all of the things that were going on around them, that they were genuinely concerned about their loved ones becoming vrykolakas, because they weren't being buried in church grounds. They weren't being buried in the sacred ground they were supposed to lay to rest in. So people were genuinely concerned that if they didn't bury their loved ones properly, they were going to have a serious vrykolakas problem on their hands. So how do you solve that problem of, I can't bury my dad, my brother, whoever died in the church burial ground because there's like a wait list 7 months long. What do I do? Oh, okay, I'll just behead the corpse. And considering the lack of recorded vrykolakas cases in Greece during World War II, I would argue it worked. But you may at this point be asking the question, why go to such lengths to prevent a vrykolakas? Well, according to legend, they are a lot easier to keep buried than they are to put back down. A vrykolakas could be created in a number of ways. It could be somebody who was sacrilegious, somebody who was buried in unconsecrated ground, someone who was excommunicated, or, oddly enough, one who ate the meat of sheep killed by a werewolf. Yes, the werewolves are involved, and they are not the same thing. I will say that last one makes me think about neurodegenerative diseases like Creutzfeldt-Jakob, and, maybe this was a situation where people were getting prion diseases, but again, that doesn't explain all of it. Now, since these monsters were sacrilegious or immoral in life, they became downright violent in undeath. And they're not pretty to look at. Vrykolakas are described as bodies which do not decay, but do swell and develop a flush complexion. One account describes them as being fresh and gorged with new blood. And behaviorally, they're definitely not the neutral type. We've talked about a few different monsters and gods and creatures of various sorts on this channel, and a lot of the time, they're pretty much, they'll behave to you how you behave to them. Some of them are downright evil, some are even helpful. But with the vrykolakas, there's no gray area. It's back and it wants to hurt you. They will, at the very best, roam around looking weird and causing panic, or at their worst, they will just break into your home and kill you. And not only will they kill you, they will then either suck you dry of blood, or they will devour your body. There's also some versions of the legend that say that they can cause plagues simply by walking around and infecting the area with their yichness. They're said to walk around town, knocking on doors, calling out your name, and if you don't answer, they will simply move on to the next house. However, if you do answer the door, then you're gonna die in 7 days, basically. Not necessarily 7, but a few days later, you will die. And if you die in this manner in some versions of the legend, you too become a vrykolakas. At one point, this actually led to a custom in certain parts of Greece where you would not answer the door on the first knock, just in case. And so you would then wait until the next knock. But when you look at stuff like that in folklore and in history, it really speaks to the depth of belief in these things. And that doesn't necessarily speak to the truth of it, but it does tell you that these were things that people believed in very seriously, and that superstition used to be a much more common aspect of our daily life than it is today. In other versions of the vrykolakas calls out to you and you answer the door and then you die a few days later and become one yourself, there is another version of that in which if you answer it the first time, it's not there, but you go back to bed, you go to sleep, it then breaks into your home. It will then enter, find the sleeping resident, and sit on their chest until they suffocate, at which point it will either drink their blood or eat their corpse. As you can imagine, that sounds a lot like a number of sleep paralysis things we've covered, including the incubus, but without the eating the corpse part. So what I'm trying to make a point about here in comparing all of these different creatures is how broad vampire mythology used to be versus how extraordinarily narrow it has become. Interestingly enough, as far as the varicolocask goes, the cannibalism seems to be the more common than the bloodsucking in these legends. And on top of that, it seems to grow more powerful with each meal. The longer you let a varicolocask go, the more difficult it's going to be to kill. And when you compare that to certain versions of the Wendigo legend, I find that parallel fascinating. Because in that as well, you have, in some versions, again, this is not all of them, that the Wendigo grows in proportion to its last meal until they're towering to the height of trees. So you see those sort of, consuming a human being gives you some sort of superpowers, appears in a number of different folktales. Of course, in this version, it's a dead human, so it's not quite the same. But even if you caught a fresh one, it was going to be a little bit more difficult to kill. It could have risen from the grave for the first time that night. You're still not going to be able to just stab it. A varicolocask can only be killed by rendering the body unusable. So the easiest, the simple solution is beheading, but sometimes they would try impalement or cutting the body into pieces, and then, of course, afterwards, after you had gotten rid of its ability to move and do things, then you'd burn it. Another aspect of this that's very fascinating is that the varicolocask legend actually made it over to Western Europe before the vampire did, so it may have kind of acted as a primer for later legends. But as you can see, the varicolocask is not a true vampire. It's got some similarities, but it's also very clearly something else than what we recognize as a vampire today. And that may be due to some cultural syncretism between the Greeks and the Balkan peoples, the Slavs who invaded that area. After all, as I said, the word varicolocask comes from the Bulgarian word varikolak. So those aspects that are more of the modern vampire that we understand, where did those come from? One of the leading theories is the Slavs. Clearly what we have today is an amalgam. The vampire is not its own simple ancient thing that naturally evolved to where it is. It's a collection of other folklore elements that were all kind of copied and pasted onto this Bram Stoker character. But a number of those things that make it the vampire seem to have moved into the region with those Slavic people. Of course, the Slavs are kind of a mysterious group. We don't know a ton about their origins, and the English-speaking world has not done a ton of research on this. It is making headway in the Slavic-speaking world, but I can't read Polish or Ukrainian or Russian, and there's not a ton of it translated into English, so I had to go with some secondhand sources here. The Slavs were known to the Romans as the Veneti, and they inhabited the cold, dark forests of what is now Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, as well as a few other scattered areas, but that was the core of the Slavic world. Now, the traditional belief about the Slavs was that they were kind of like the Greek Helots of Sparta, where they were an enslaved tribe or sub-ethnic group, in this case, of the Nordic peoples. So the Norwegians, the Swedes, it's believed specifically either the Swedes or the Goths. And the suggestion is that at some point they decided to go into exile, they left that area and went down into Russia. Of course, back then, Russia wasn't called Russia, because the Rus are the people who made it called Russia, and they weren't Slavic. There was a whole thing. The Rus thing is complicated. We'll get to it in a History Hut video. But that theory is kind of being abandoned over time, partially because it seems to have evolved as medieval mythology. As new sources and archaeological evidence are discovered, what we're finding is that they probably were native to that area. According to the 6th century author Jordanus, they were described as a monotheistic, semi-nomadic, democratic people, but this was likely a misunderstanding of their theology. In deep contrast to the horseback-based cultures of the Eurasian steppe, who were their neighbors, examples like the Sarmatians and the Roxolani, the Slavs preferred to fight on foot. However, their use of bows, spears, shields, and pretty light armor, if any armor at all, is pretty much in line with the combat techniques of the region, aside from the horse aspect. The Slavic religion does appear to have been similar, possibly connected to, in fact most likely connected to, the other Indo-European faiths, like the Greek mythology, the Norse mythology, but where it really seems to strike the greatest similarity is Zoroastrianism. Like Zoroastrianism, this is a dualist system with a god of good and a god of not good, a god of darkness, basically an order and a chaos, a light and dark kind of setup. And that chief creator being rules over a number of lesser divinities. These could be, if you're trying to compare with Abrahamic religion, what you'd be most familiar with likely, you would think of this as God and angels. Now, of course, in the Abrahamic faiths, there isn't a second god of darkness. There's just the one God and then all of the lesser divinities, but you can kind of connect it in that way. But gathering any real concrete information is really difficult because prior to the 9th century and the introduction of the Cyrillic writing system as well as Christianity as a whole to the Slavic peoples, they weren't exactly writing things down, they were just making sculptures. And in some other ways, it does seem like it might have been related to the other Indo-European faiths of the more Western side of things. Not the Eastern Zoroastrianism, but instead that idea of gods of the sky and the earth, in that their god Perun seems to be of the same stock as Zeus and Thor. Now, if you look on the map that's near my head, you'll see that area that the Slavs are in, that's not really the area that the Slavs are now in the Balkans. It's kind of up to the northeast of that. So I'm going to tell you how they got to the Balkans. The Slavs were kind of filling a vacuum. The rampage of the Huns through Europe in the 5th century had displaced massive numbers of German tribes, and a lot of them moved into the west of Europe, into Spain, and even down into Africa, with the Vandals taking what was once Carthage. But after the death of Attila, the Hunnic threat kind of collapsed as the different tribes began to fight one another and to settle down, and eventually kind of meld into the Balkans. Well, after all of that turmoil was kind of over, there was a lot of land that wasn't really being inhabited by any large significant number of people. That left a power vacuum, and the Slavs were happy to fill it. The Slavs who moved into the regions that used to be controlled by the Germans became the Western Slavs, the Poles, the Czechs, and the Slovaks. Those who moved into the old, more Eurasian territory became the Russians, the Belarusians, and the Ukrainians, as well as a few others. And then the Slavs who moved into the Balkans and kind of melded into that Hunnic, Dacian, Roman population melting pot that was going there, those guys became the Bulgarians, the Serbs, and the modern Macedonians. Obviously, there is a lot more to it, and there are a lot more different Slavic cultural subgroups, but this is a video about vampires, not Slavs. But all of that was important because it's through Old Church Slavonic, which is the first literary language of the Slavs, that we get the word vampire. Now, Old Church Slavonic was standardized by the saints Cyril and Methodius as a method of converting the Slavs to Christianity. They realized that it was going to be really hard to explain all of this to the Slavs if they had no written language and no prior understanding of Christianity. You kind of needed one of the two here. So what they did was they created a writing system for the Slavic languages, likely based on those of the Slavs living around Thessaloniki, and they presented that to the Slavic people. Hey, here's a writing system that is built for the language you speak. Now here's a Bible written in it. Now in Old Church Slavonic, the term opiri eventually evolved into vampir or vapir, depending on which Balkan language you're talking about. So we've got the term vampire, but what about the monster we recognize as the vampire? It's complicated. It's unclear precisely when the Slavic vampire legends originated, but Professor of English Alexis M. Milmeen at Texas Tech argues that it was actually sort of an umbrella term, much like the Revenant. She notes that the Slavs have many different bloodsuckers and considers them all to be subclasses of the vampire. The Varkolaki, for example, the Romanian version of the Vrykolikas, is more associated with the moon and eating people, which to me sounds a lot more like werewolves, but of course, the Siskoi refers to a vampire that is not undead, but rather still alive and sucking blood. And then there's the Moroi, which are either living or dead, but they suck out life force. They suck out your energy, not your blood. So it seems to be specifically through the Slavic strigoi that we get the vampire. Of course, the word strigoi derives from the Latin strix or striga, not to be confused with the Albanian striga, which is, again, a similar thing here, but not quite a vampire. Both strix and strigoi were words for a witch, but they were also words for blood-sucking birds, and probably originally the word for owl. It is wild how many times the word for owl becomes the word for something absolutely monstrous. Eventually the term striga made it into Romanian as the word strigoi. Now, it might be important to note for anybody who's really in tune with Romanian history and culture in the chat right now, Romanians are not ethnically Slavic for the most part. They are ethnically Romanian. But they were heavily, heavily influenced by both Roman and Slavic culture. One early account of a strigoi, which was recorded in Istria, which is a region that now makes up parts of Slovenia, Italy, and Croatia, described the activities of a man named Jor Grando back in 1689. As in the recording, the documentation was 1689. The activities were between 1656 and whatever was 17 years after that, because I'm bad at mental math. Now, Jor Grando was a man, just a stonemason, living in the little town of Kringa, and he died of illness. Nothing particularly awful. But Jor, he didn't stay down. No, Mr. Grando, he decided he wasn't done quite yet. So he rose from the grave every night for 16 years to terrorize the village. Eventually, the town priest, a man by the name of Giorgio, got word that someone was knocking on people's doors at night. And some of those people would then die a few days later. Come to him, hey man, I'm hearing there was all these strange knocks, and then boom, Stephen's dead. Now, if you're thinking, wow, Aiden, that's similar to the Vrykolakas legend, it is. It's possible that this is where the Vrykolakas thing got it. It's also possible that the Vrykolakas gave it to them. The anatomy of any given legend is a truly fascinating thing. Grando would also appear to his wife, who described him as a perfectly preserved corpse with a broad smile, who would then do unspeakable things to her. Eventually, Father Giorgio was forced to confront the strigoi, at which point he was able to ward it off with a cross and an exclamation of the name of the Lord. This caused Grando to flee, at which point a number of the villagers chased him and then tried to stab him in the chest with a wooden stake, but the stake bounced off. A little while later, several of the villagers decided that they would try and get him while he was sleeping, which would be, of course, during the day. So they dug up his grave, they took his body out, and what they found was, again, a perfectly preserved corpse. Father Giorgio said a blessing and then tried to stab the sleeping Grando in the heart with a stake, but yet again, stake bounced off. Seeing no other option, he then performed an exorcism while two villagers sawed the head off of the body. According to the tale, Mr. Grando let out a final blood-curdling shriek as blood poured from his neck wound, and then died, but for good that time. Then in 1714, we get the strigoi from the Moldavian perspective. A soldier by the name of Dmitri Cantemir wrote about the strigoi as the Moldovians and the Transylvanians understood this legend. But to him, they were more like witches than they were blood-sucking undead monsters. And you might notice, I said that we seem to get the vampire from the strigoi, but in neither of these stories was blood-sucking actually involved. The Moldavian version doesn't really suck blood. In fact, it might not even be undead. And the Istrian version, while horrifying, also did not suck anybody's blood. What that means is that the vampire, it's not done evolving yet. We're still in the early days. It took a while for lore to be compiled and added into something recognizable as one individual creature, rather than just kind of a smattering of different folkloric beliefs from scattered villages. It's important to remember that at that time, unless your job was being a trader or a missionary, the likelihood that you were ever, as a peasant, going to see any village outside your own and maybe the next largest town in the region was very low. You basically did not spend a ton of time traveling back then. The nearest village might be 10 miles away, and that was a full day's walk. But by 1882, a lot more lore was added to this entire overarching concept of what was sort of becoming the vampire through the strigoi. Of course, whether that is by invention or by ethnographic study is a little bit hard to determine. According to the late 19th century author Teodor Barada, the strigoi could be either living or undead. It wasn't necessarily one of the two. There were a couple of different ways that you could become a living strigoi. One of those was to be the seventh child in a family, or to live a life of just unrepentant sin. For those who became strigoi after death, death without marriage was an option, death by execution specifically for perjury, death by suicide, and death by a witch's curse would all possibly turn you into one of these things. Of course, there were others like excommunication or apostasy, but the sin part kind of contains all of that. These later, more concrete strigoi are described as being bald at the top of their head with an elongated spine in the form of a hairy tail. They do not like garlic or onions, and they like to avoid incense. Now, of course, when you look at garlic, that does bring up the vampire thoughts because we know that vampires don't like garlic, but the idea that strong-smelling foods, herbs, or woods might be able to ward off the supernatural is pretty universal across the planet. Skinwalkers, for example, while being witches and not some sort of supernatural creature themselves, are not big fans of things like cedar and sage. Striga, of course, can do more than just suck blood, though. They can cause droughts, they can steal milk and wheat, they can cause plagues, and they just kind of can cause a general sense of exhaustion in the population. A few years after Théodore was writing, a French geologist started writing about things in 1887. What did he write about? Well, Jacques Reclus was very interested in Romanian burials. He recorded that red-haired people were more likely to become strigoi, and it was believed that they could shapeshift into a flea, dog, frog, or bedbug, at which point they would sneak into your home and suck your blood that way. Not by coming in and, as their person with their sharp teeth and being like, no, none of that. They were turning into a flea. Oh, also specifically, it was young women's blood in the French guy's version. For this reason, people who it was expected they might become a strigoi, that of course being people who lived a life of sin, people who killed themselves, people who were witches, people who were the seventh child, people who were redheads. You're seeing that there are just a lot of things here. Yeah, there's a lot of things here. They would be buried with extra nails in their coffin, as well as a stake through their chest, and in some cases, even more stakes involved. And at this point, the modern vampire image begins to show itself. We have a few things. They are allergic to garlic. They rise from the grave at night. It drinks blood. You put a stake through the heart, the whole 9 yards. But how did the strigoi become the vampire? Because those are two very different words, and as we said before, vampire seems to be a much more overarching term here. Strigoi is very specific. It's talking about a very discrete piece of folklore. Well, one way could be through the way it made its way over to the West. In 1732, in the London Journal in England, vampires were described. The author tells of certain dead bodies in Hungary that killed several persons by sucking out their blood. Now, why might the term vampire have been used here rather than specifically strigoi? Well, it might be that when the story was being told, the Hungarians didn't really reference the fact that there were multiple different types of vampires here, and just, maybe these people were killed by different kinds of vampires. Maybe one was by a strigoi and one was by a moroi, in which case, you've got two different vampires. So you just say vampires, because those aren't the same thing. He goes on to clarify that in one case, a man killed 4 people after he himself died, and that when he was exhumed, his body bled from the nose, ears, and mouth. He then says, according to custom, they drove a stake through his heart, at which he gave a horrid groan and lost a great deal of blood. Now that sounds a lot like the Jor Grando story, doesn't it? Now, of course, depending on how long the body has been dead, that could just happen. Gas releases can kind of sound like a moan, and if you stab a recently dead body, it will bleed. Not as quickly, but it will bleed. Finally, this article says that victims of a vampire will become vampires themselves. When I read through all these sources, when I'm looking at this story, from a historian's perspective, what I'm seeing is that this is likely a legend that got co-opted over time. That as it made its way west across Europe, little things got added on. It also seems to have passed through numerous languages, at which point vampire went from being a term about a group of different creatures, a classification, so to speak, to being its own specific monster. A blood-sucking revenant with a heavy focus on those aspects of the strigoi from Romania. Thus, Bram Stoker's Dracula character, and this is published in 1897, is not itself a strigoi. While much of the character may match late strigoi legends, this seems to very specifically be its own new thing, the vampire, the modern vampire. One distinction from the strigoi is that Dracula, in Stoker's work, is an aristocrat. He's a nobleman. Many of the stories of strigoi and of Raikolikas, those are laymen, those are commoners. Now, does Stoker necessarily say that a layman can't become a vampire? Absolutely not. But he focuses it on an aristocrat. Dracula is described to us as a tall, older gentleman. He's got a bushy, long white mustache. He's got thick eyebrows. He's extremely pale. He has very sharp teeth and a full head of thick, curly hair. And of course, the man sleeps in a coffin. He must drink other people's blood to preserve his own vitality, and he possesses an intellect. And that differs from the strigoi in a number of significant ways. Strigoi, of course, are bald, they have normal teeth, and they do not seem to possess much of an intellect. It seems that they are pretty much pure evil, pure hunt. And on top of that, there's a number of behavioral differences. Dracula is a very calculating vampire. He does things for a purpose. The Strigoi that we read about, well, they really just are following base instinct. So how did we get from a Strigoi like Grando to a vampire like Dracula? Well, a significant amount of it comes from Stoker's influences in creating the character outside of just folklore. For example, Dracula gets his name from the 15th century voivode of Wallachia, Vlad III Dracula. Dracula being a surname meaning son of the dragon. And since voivode is probably an unfamiliar term to you, the word itself means warlord, but it was kind of akin to a prince or a duke in Eastern Europe. The voivode of Wallachia was second in command only to the king of Hungary. At least that is within his domain of Wallachia. Vlad was called Son of the Dragon because his father, Vlad II Dracul, was part of the Christian Order of the Dragon. The Order of the Dragon were a league of monarchs and aristocrats who pledged themselves as warrior kings to an extent to protect Christendom. They especially were interested in protecting it from the very, very, very rapidly encroaching Ottoman Empire. In 1436, Vlad II was appointed voivode of Wallachia by Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund of Luxembourg. He rewarded this very, very prestigious gift of his overlord by immediately, well not immediately, but very soon after, defecting back to the Ottoman Empire that he had just pledged to fight. The Ottoman Sultan demanded two of Vlad II's sons, Vlad III and Radu. Now, these were to be kept as hostages, but you probably have a modern opinion on what hostage means. We need to go with a medieval opinion on what hostage means here. In the modern day, you think of hostage as somebody who is, duct taped in the back room with a bunch of nameless goons with machine guns standing around and maybe a bomb somewhere. Well, in the medieval period, that's not what a hostage was. Back then, when you made a deal with another nobleman, someone above you, usually, you were given hostages, or you would give hostages. This meant that they had leverage on you. So, if you decided to betray your overlord, they would have your son, your nephew, somebody that was important to you, maybe your brother, and they would kill that person if you betrayed them. So there was kind of a weird situation here where, as a hostage, you were treated very well. You were given your own space, you were given your money, you were given an allowance, you got to come to all the feasts. Being a hostage was a pretty good deal, except for the fact that you had no real freedom outside of the palace, and if whoever you were a hostage for defected, you were immediately getting executed. Vlad II pulled a cool trick and managed to avoid getting his son killed while also not fighting for the Ottomans anymore by being displaced. A revolt in 1447 ousted Vlad II and placed on the throne his replacement, Vladislav II. The Ottomans weren't exactly happy about losing their puppet, and instead of invading themselves, they went, you know what would be good? A second puppet. And they sent Vlad III in with an Ottoman army. They were able to do that because Vladislav II was off elsewhere in Kosovo fighting somebody else. So, Vlad Dracula, Vlad III, managed to actually retake the throne of Wallachia and kept it for a whopping 2 months. See, the problem with invading while the other guy is away on campaign is that he's away on campaign with his army, and if he doesn't lose, he's coming back. So Vlad Dracula goes into exile for about 8 years, and then things get weird. At some point during his stay in the Ottoman Empire, where he was primarily in exile, Vlad Dracula became a little disillusioned with his Ottoman friends. Dracula ended up defecting to Hungary, going back, getting an army there, and then invading Wallachia from the west.
I'm playing both sides so that I always come out on top.
On July 22nd, 1456, Vlad met Vladislav at the heads of their respective armies outside of the town of Targzor, and the two decided to duel rather than fighting a pitched battle that would destroy both their armies and also probably the town they were near. Vlad Dracula ended up winning that duel and took back the throne for himself, and you might think, well, that was a whole lot of fighting, but you know what, now it's all over, we can be peaceful. No, if you've ever heard of this guy, you know exactly how this goes. Dracula took a zero-tolerance policy on crime, punishing even the most minor of crimes with execution, and also purged most of the nobility. And of course, he was a man of theater, so when it came time to deal with all of the nobles that betrayed his father, what he did was invite over 200 of them to an Easter banquet, and then he had all of the women and elderly killed and enslaved all of the men. Oddly enough, that is usually the opposite of how it goes. Usually it's that the men are killed and the women are enslaved. I could go into many of the awful things that Vlad III did, but that would take a while, so I'll tell you this. He killed over 80,000 people. 80,000 he executed. And many of those people were executed by being impaled on stakes and put up outside the city walls, leading to Vlad no longer being called Dracula by his own people, but rather the epithet that he maintains to this day, Vlad the Impaler. So ladies and gentlemen, that is the man upon whom Dracula is somewhat based. Obviously, a lot of the stuff about Dracula was already set before Dracula was involved as a name for the character. It was going to be in Eastern Europe, it was probably going to be Transylvania, all of that. But in the late 20th century, a couple of scholars, Elizabeth Miller and Bob Kieran, began to ask the question, was Dracula really the original basis for this story, and was he the only basis for this story? An alternative theory came into discussion in which Stoker's decision to write a vampire book was not entirely just Dracula, but also his Irish heritage, because the Irish have a legend of a guy called Abertach. This seems to come from pre-Christian Ireland, and the story is about a tyrant. Now, he's also called the Dwarf, but he's a tyrant magician, possibly a warlord or a petty king. And he just terrorizes the people of Londonderry during his reign. According to some versions of the legend, he's actually slain by the famous legendary chieftain Finn McCool, but that's possibly a later addition. But we'll use McCool's name for this. McCool slays him and they bury him in a standing position. Of course, he appears the next day in a fashion more cruel and vigorous than ever. Finn McCool sees no problem with this and kills him a second time, but he comes back a second time. For the third time, Finn's like, you know what, I'm gonna ask a druid for some help here. He has a conversation with the druid tells him what he needs to do, he goes back, he kills Abertach again, and then he buries him upside down. And then Abertach doesn't come back. Now, like I said, the association with Finn McCool is dubious. It might have been a much later addition. There is a instance in which Finn McCool does fight a guy named something similar to Abertach, and it might be that the two are conflated, or this might just be a separate legend of the same event. It's hard to say, because the Irish didn't really write much down. But some scholars have suggested that Abertach is actually the original inspiration for Dracula, because he is a nobleman, he's some sort of ruler, he is a terrifying figure, and he is very difficult to kill, and it takes a legendary hero to do it, much like it takes Van Helsing to get Dracula. And of course, Abertach, while he's not depicted as a bloodsucker, isn't the only vampiric legend in Ireland or in Irish folklore. Now, of course, we're going to Scotland for this part, but the Scots were originally Gaels themselves who then intermixed with the English and the Norse, and they have the legend of the Bavanshi, and we talked about that in our Banshee video, which you can see right here. The Bavanshi is a beautiful young woman wearing a long green dress that hides her deer hooves that show you she's not human. And this is a very common trait to Scottish monsters and legends, is that they will be humanoid, but there will be something that gives it away. A horse's tail, bunny ears, something like that that tells you what you're dealing with is actually one of the Fae. The Bavanshi kills by seducing men, much like the succubus, and then draining their blood while they sleep. So the Bavanshi is actually a vampire. It actually does the vampiric thing. And these creatures often appear to hunters, miners, people just, off away from home who express the wish for companionship at night. We'll put it that way. And in one instance of this story, the men weren't just drained, their throats were cut and their chests laid open. Is it proven here that Stoker got his idea from Irish and Scottish folklore and then involved Eastern European? That's by no means concrete. But there are enough changes to this Strigoi that kind of sound right for Abertach and the Bavanshi that you can see how Stoker may have involved Anglo-Irish legends into his vampire story to create something that was genuinely new and not just a derivation or a rehashing of an older figure. And of course, because of Stoker's work, vampires have gone from being a classification to being their own thing. Although I do often still see things described as vampiric that do not necessarily fit the Dracula version. Vampire seems to be a very, very broad term in the older mythology that discusses something that sucks something out of you. That seems to be the big issue here, is that it is something that drains you. After that, it could be any number of different things. It could drain any number of different fluids. So the vampire as we know it today, the modern vampire, really arguably should have its own name. Because if you go to the word vampire and you apply it to what it really means, you get this stuff all over the world. And I think that's really cool personally, but you don't get the exact idea of what you're expecting for vampire. So what are some of those other vampires like? Well, they're essentially universal. You find something that drains you in basically every culture on Earth. In the Eastern tradition, for example, you actually have another one of these situations with an umbrella term for vampire. In this case, in the Philippines, it's aswang. And their blood-sucking variant is the Mandurugo, not to be confused with the Mandalorian. It disguises itself as a beautiful young woman by day and infiltrates the community by marrying into one of the families. Considering it was very common in a lot of older cultures, in a lot of older times, to take a wife from a different village, this is not entirely unusual. There would be no red flags here to another woman coming into town seeking a husband. At night, however, this beautiful young woman transforms. She grows wings and produces a proboscis, which she uses either to suck blood out of her husband as he sleeps, or to fly away to other nearby towns and suck the blood of their men. In China, they have a legend of the Jiangshi, and these guys are known as hopping vampires. They have the appearance of whatever state of decomposition they were in when reanimated, and they can be created by necromancy, possession, absorbing life force somehow, not being buried at all, the soul failing to leave the body, or by being attacked by another Jiangshi while living, depending on the tradition you're talking about. This, of course, is more of a life force sucker, kind of like the moroi, where it sucks the energy out of you, not your blood, but still vampiric. And the legend seems to have possibly originated with the idea that Taoist priests would reanimate corpses of people who died far from home, because, of course, they lacked any good vehicle to get them the miles and miles back to their home village. There was apparently a Chinese belief that if you died away from your home, your soul would be homesick. So these priests would reanimate the corpses, place them between two bamboo rods, and kind of help them walk back to safety, back to home. It is possible that this practice did actually exist, but that it wasn't that they were reanimating the vampires, but rather putting them upright and then tying them to the bamboo rods, and then the flexing of the bamboo made them appear to hop. And then if you go even further east, you of course get to America, where even before colonization, there were vampire legends. The Wyandot have the Hustra Du, not to be confused with the hardcore band Husker Du, which possesses the corpse of the recently deceased, animates it, and then uses it to consume the living. And of course, with this specific legend, I will say, given the proximity of the Wyandot and the Ojibwa peoples, I would not be entirely shocked if this one was a variant of the Wendigo legend. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of Native American folklore available when it comes to like these really granular creatures and legends, so it's hard to find information. I'll probably have to talk to somebody who is Huron-Wyandot ancestry. And like I said, these legends appear all over the planet, but if I were to cover every single vampire type, it would take me a really long time, and honestly, that seems more like a job for Wendigoon for one of his icebergs. So I'll leave it at that. Now, I will say this about this video. People have been asking me to do a vampire video for almost 2 years now. And part of the reason I held off on doing it was because vampires, as they exist today, don't exist in folklore. They exist as I've just explained it. And I'm sure there are academic sources that go into more detail than I did, and I would love to have time to read them, but I spend a week researching for these videos, so you can imagine. But if you're more interested, I'll see if there's any other sources I can find, and I'll try to link to publicly available copies of the stuff I found through library search engines. So with all of that said, if you like what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can support us on Patreon for just $1 a month. That will get you access to any of the exclusive content we put up on there, as well as the higher tiers getting you things like, canvas prints and sweatshirts and things like that. So we have that. We also have our podcast, which goes live Sunday nights at 7 p.m., where we talk about these topics live in discussion format and do a Q&A at the end for you. If you want to catch the podcast, but you don't have time on Sunday nights to watch, you can catch it here on our YouTube channel, or you can check it out on Spotify, Apple Music, or anywhere you get your podcasts. And if you're wondering, Aiden, how do you spend all of this time researching? How are you so upbeat and wired all the time? Well, this is how. Mount Pocono Perk from Tableau Roasting Company and the Lore Lodge. It's great. And if you want to support the Lore Lodge in public, if you want to tell everybody how much you love this channel, you can of course buy our merch from thelorelodge.shop. We've got a bunch of different designs and we're always adding new ones. And if you like what we do with this kind of content, but you want to see it about history or the Bible, we've got 2 new channels, The History Hut and The Weird Bible. Content is coming to both of those, hopefully next month, aside from what's already there. I also want to include a special shout out to MyHeritage. Thank you for sponsoring this video. You guys taught me a lot of things about myself, like that I'm Jewish and Balkan. I didn't know that. So with all that said, thank you for watching the video. We'll see you on the next one. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.